The House of Representatives moved to pass the $1.9 trillion stimulus package today by a vote of 220 to 211. But while some are seeing it as much needed relief, others are focusing on the numbers, mainly the fact that the total debt is exceeding the size of the U.S. economy for the first time since World War II. And the U.S. isn't alone here. The European Union passed more than $900 billion in COVID relief in December. Financed by joint debt among member nations, it brought the country's debt to GDP ratio to over 97%. Nearby, the newly independent United Kingdom has passed more than $550 billion in stimulus since the start of the pandemic. Government debt hit $2.8 trillion, or nearly 100% of the country's GDP, marking its highest point since 1960. India announced more than $35 billion in relief back in November, bringing the total spent on stimulus last year to 15% of the country's GDP, as its public debt reached a record high of nearly 90%. Russia passed more than $70 billion in stimulus back in June, but by the end of 2020, government debt accounted for only around 18% of Russia's GDP. While China was hesitant to pass billions in stimulus the way it did back in 2008, its debt to GDP ratio still soared to over a record 300% in 2020. Meanwhile, Japan passed around $3 trillion in stimulus last year, as the debt in the world's third largest economy soared to more than 240% of its GDP. As a result, global debt reached an all-time high of $281 trillion by the end of 2020. We're going to take a look at what that means for the status of global inflation. But first, here's RT's Trinity Chavez with the latest on the next stimulus package heading to the White House.
Today, as the country tries to turn a corner on a pandemic that has killed more than 500,000 people in the U.S. and has left millions more without jobs, the House of Representatives is passing the vote on President Biden's $1.9 trillion stimulus package.
And everything in this package is designed to relieve the suffering and to meet the most urgent needs of the nation.
Just days before unemployment aid runs out, Congress has approved a landmark legislation placing President Biden on the cusp of an early triumph that the Democratic Party says will transform the economy and provide much-needed financial relief to millions of Americans.
We promised to send people back to work by helping to revive and supercharge the economy. Mission accomplished.
The bill includes $1,400 checks for Americans with income below a certain threshold, $75,000 for individuals, $112,500 for heads of household, and $150,000 for couples filing jointly will each receive $1,400 per person as a direct deposit or mailed check. The legislation will also pay up to $3,600 a year in tax credits per child, extend increases in food stamp benefits, extend $300 a week boost in unemployment assistance, and $8.5 billion to help rural hospitals.
It's a remarkable, historic, transformative piece of legislation which goes a very long way.
And while the nearly 6,000-page legislation does not include the minimum wage increase to $15 an hour, it does include a $350 billion bailout to local and state governments, $220 billion to states, territories, and tribal governments, and $130 billion to cities and counties to mitigate the fiscal effects stemming from the pandemic. But a change by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to the allocation formula from being based on population to the unemployment rate, now 27 states will lose more than $31 billion in funding. Among the biggest winners, California, Texas, and New York.
I think a lot of people have a concern that Speaker Pelosi took advantage of the crisis to fill the bill with primarily things that have nothing to do with COVID.
The bill garnering fierce criticism from Republicans who say that it's a pork-filled cluster that has little to do with the coronavirus, but is disguised as COVID-19 relief.
This massive spending bill masquerading as COVID relief will bankrupt the country. It will not rescue the country, bankrupt it.
Exactly how much pork is in that bill? Well, $50 billion is going to FEMA, $1.5 billion to Amtrak, $7.6 billion to improve internet access, and $270 million to the National Endowment for Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities, and $50 million for family planning.
Only 9% goes towards defeating the virus. $1.5 billion for Amtrak, which is already sitting on $1 billion in unspent aid. Can someone explain what that has to do with COVID relief? Anybody?
This is the day that individuals, when they know that their unemployment check is coming, they have hope because now they can pay their rent, pay the mortgage.
Meantime, Republicans say they could have had a bill that was a fraction of the cost, but the House Speaker and Majority Leader shut out Republicans. All of this unfolding in the nation's capital as the country's debt has officially shot up to $28 trillion. Reporting for Boom Bust, Trinity Chavez, RT.
For more on this, let's bring in Boom Bust co-host and investigative journalist Ben Swan and host of Economic Update and author of The Sickness is the System, Professor Richard Wolff. Professor, I'll start with you here. Now, of course, the issue is whether or not this stimulus package will actually stimulate the U.S. economy. Do you believe that will happen?
Well, you know, it's always in the details what the words mean. Will it give a boost to the economy in the short run? Probably yes. It's a lot of money. It's being pushed in. Hopefully it'll be pushed in quickly. It'll give a boost. I'm reminded of what President Obama did back in 2009 when he also gave the economy a boost. But we learned with Mr. Obama's boost that it didn't last and it didn't fundamentally transform the economy. A lot of people said it would, just like they're saying it now. A lot of promises were made, just like they're being made now. It didn't work out that way, which is why we had such a crash this last year. So for me, what's the key issue here is the sustainability of whatever boost it gets. And I don't think it's enough, and I think it's very late in the day. So I'm very worried that the promises and the great hopes that have been generated here will not see fruition beyond that initial boost.
Yeah, and we've definitely been talking about stimulus for a full year now, waiting for Congress to do something. And it seems like each time they do pass one of these packages, it's months later than it should be. And of course, as in this case, it includes a lot of different provisions and a lot of spending that many say isn't about COVID relief. Now, Ben, I want to ask you about that one because we've heard that criticism, as was mentioned in Trinity's package, that there is all of this money, that it doesn't go to COVID relief as it should. So how do you see it?
Yeah, well, listen, I think it's pretty obvious here. A lot of this money, as was explained very well by Trinity, is not going to go to COVID relief. But you really have to make it come down to one of two ideas. Either we're going to spend ridiculous amounts of money and yes, significantly devalue currency for the sake of putting money into the hands of who? Into the hands of people who need it. If you believe in that school of economic thought, fine. But then actually put the money there. That's not where the money's going. When you're giving $1 billion, $1.5 billion to Amtrak, that's not putting money in the hands of the people who need it. So it's this idea that, oh, we're going to help the people who need it, but then you don't. And that is what we saw back in 2008. That's what we've seen for the last few decades in the United States. And it's happening not just in the US, by the way, it's happening in Europe, it's happening all around the world, where massive amounts of money is being generated and spent, and it's going to crash the economic system. And maybe that's not even necessarily a bad thing, because the reality is this economic system's barely hanging on by a thread as it is.
Yeah, and right now the U.S. isn't the only one relying a lot on those stimulus packages. And Professor, I want to ask you about that too, because we know that countries around the world have been passing large stimulus deals while holding down interest rates. What is the chance that we will see global inflation in the near future?
Well, you know, there's a lot of loose talk about that. There's no excuse for that. Is it possible that we can stimulate the economy without an inflation this way? Absolutely. Is it possible that this kind of money creation on a massive scale to try to save the economy will provoke an inflation? Of course, the answer is yes, too. Many other factors will determine which way it goes. Nobody can see the future. The idea that you want to pass this bill, and I would disagree slightly, it's not just for COVID. Stimulus is what it's called for a good reason. You want to stimulate the economy, and I agree with that as a purpose. But Ben is absolutely right. If you keep giving it to the same corporate leaders, government bureaucrats who have failed to make it a mass program for the people who need it. Why should you believe they're going to start it now? And that's true in other countries. We had a century of giving foreign aid to countries who need it, only to discover that it went into the hands of a few and it never quite trickled down. That happens at home as well as abroad, and that's a serious problem. And Ben is right that it's the economic structure we have that's the frustrating problem here.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it seems to be business as usual right back here at home. Not much change, even though we are dealing with these new issues over the last year. Now, Ben, what are your expectations for the economy? I mean, there are predictions that by the end of the year, the economy will come back in a major way. Will the stimulus bill help it in the process?
No. So the stimulus bill will do nothing to bring back the economy. What will bring back the economy is allowing people to go back to work, allowing people to reopen their businesses. When that happens, and either because politicians allow it to happen, or because people get sick and tired and fed up and say we're just going to do it on our own. Either way, that's the only way that the economy comes back.
Yeah, all right. Well, that same question to you, Professor Wolf. How do you see this economic stimulus impacting the economy here in the U.S. in the next year?
Well, right now it's having a kind of euphoric effect with these enormous promises that it's going to solve our problems and bring us our economy back. Here's the irony. This constant message of bringing it back. Back to what?
Yeah.
To what it was before Mr. Trump became president? The way it was before, that's why he became president. And if we can't do markedly better than getting back to where we were, which is the best we can hope for with this stimulus, if we don't make basic changes, we're going to have a repeat. But just like this crisis is worse than the one under Obama, the next one will promise to be yet worse, and we don't have that much more slack in what we can tolerate as a society.
Well, excellent points to consider here. Ben Swan, Professor Richard Wolf, thank you both for your time.